Impossible to swallow. Phil heard Abilene in the next room yelling at the people from the trading department. "We are a research team. We don't give trading orders. We give suggestions. We don't tell you what to do. Traders trade with their own brains. How dare you put the responsibility on me? Your department isn't ruined by a few linguistic errors. You have tons of reference material, so reference." The other people in the room were shouting back, but they must have been on the far side, because Phil did not hear them as clearly as he heard Abilene. Then Abilene raised her voice again. "No, it's not a mistake made by a foreigner. It's simply an incorrect copy of a few words out of millions of pages. I am sure there are other errors, but we get blamed whenever your people make mistakes. And once again you want to scapegoat one of my people." After using Chinese to argue for a moment, she added, No one is considered unqualified in my office for failing to understand Chinese. You guys trade in Dubai as well. Do you trade in Arabic? Don't you rely on information presented to you in languages you understand?" When she spoke at the top of her voice, her accent seemed to lighten her English. Hearing this, Phil knew his ass was saved, although he assumed that from now on his days in this company would be harder. But in the following several days, Abilene did not make it any harder on him. His life was just as difficult as it had always been. In the weekend work meeting, Abilene just mentioned casually to everybody, "If there is anything you are not 100% sure of, ask your colleagues. It's not something to be ashamed of." Phil and everyone present, he supposed, realized what she meant. In one email, Phil had mistakenly translated the Chinese words upper limit into lower limit because he confused the Chinese characters up and down. Because of his mistake, the trading office made a transaction that cost them millions of dollars in one morning. Daphne was so scared. She closed her Facebook page so her friends, whether they supported the strike or not, would not leave any message. She didn't even want her relatives, classmates, or friends to know she was working for the airline. She started working as a flight attendant for the airline 2 years and 9 months ago. To many, it was an enviable job. Flight attendants for most of the Asian airlines are required to be young, nice-looking, tall, and strong enough to help passengers with their luggage, and able to speak English fluently. It's almost like the requirements for fashion models. The pay for flight attendants had been reduced over the past 2 decades, but compared to how much her classmates were making as engineers or teachers or editors or travel guides, her income was still significantly higher. Their uniforms were very tight skirts, and except during the flights when they were delivering meals, for most services they were asked to wear high heels. This had become a tradition. She knew about it when she applied for the job, but recently their working conditions were getting worse and worse. The administration changed the method of calculating their working hours and benefits, and their number of flights suddenly increased without corresponding compensation. And as more and more flights were taking off after midnight to compete with the airlines from the Middle East, which joined the market recently, she began to hear whispers about a protest, even a strike. At first she pretended she did not hear it. She wished she could get over the exhausting new schedule eventually. But no, she had been asked to take the places of her colleagues more and more often because some of them quit. Some of them took leaves for not being able to meet the increasingly impossible schedules. Then one day she got called from one of her colleagues, telling her their union was organizing a strike. Her first response was that she wished she did not answer the phone call. She wished she could stay out of it. But if everyone stayed out, how could they have the bargain power to negotiate with the administration? She and her boyfriend just bought an apartment in the suburbs of Taipei and planned to get married in a couple of years. She needed a stable income. What if she lost her job? A job as a clerk in any business would not make enough money to pay off their mortgage. Abilene was a single Taiwanese woman in her early 40s, and she was also Phil's immediate supervisor in this office, the research department of the Taipei branch of a Dutch securities firm. Their work covered the markets of Taiwan, Hong Kong, and China. People working for this company came from all over the world, so multilingualism was just fundamental. Many of them spoke 3, even 4 languages. Chinese and English were the most commonly used languages, but when the local staff didn't want foreigners to hear their conversations, they used Taiwanese. Abilene had a pet phrase, impossible to swallow. At first, Phil was confused as to what she meant by that, for it could be referring to bad food, or a result of tension or conflict, or sometimes it sounded like a vow to do something. Later, he realized it actually came from the Taiwanese language. Phil came from the U.S. and was 30 years old. He got this job by, basically, boasting about his language skills. That had been his lifetime strategy, exaggerating how good he was, then making it up as soon as possible once he was offered what he sought. It brought him his Ivy League degree and several jobs resulting from short-term projects of sub-organizations of the United Nations. He had traveled extensively and seen many parts of this world, and he thought working overseas would be a cool thing. Phil had believed that working in a relatively less developed and exotic country like Taiwan was even cooler. But this job had become so demanding. Every day he returned home exhausted, without the time or energy to pick up Chinese at all. The consequence was his confusion between up and down in Chinese characters. Around the Lunar Chinese New Year 2 years ago, Phil was notified that he was being offered a job in this company, and that he should start right after the holidays. His future colleagues were also informed about his coming, so they sent him an email greeting, inviting him to spend the New Year with Abilene's family in Chiayi, her hometown. Phil accepted the invitation immediately. He was excited to see how people spend Chinese New Year's in rural Taiwan. They picked him up at a subway station in Taipei and drove south in the crazy holiday traffic. His companions were Abilene, Molly, and Jason. At first, Phil thought Molly was his future boss, since she was educated in Australia and spoke perfect English. Jason was younger than the 2 women, and his role as a male was no different from Abilene and Molly. They seemed to do everything by themselves, even carrying or moving heavy stuff. In the farming village, Phil was appalled to see how shabby Abilene's parents' home was. The structure was patched with cheap materials such as brick, concrete slabs, and plastic panels. The roof was corrugated iron. Inside the house, however, it was surprisingly tidy, although every piece of furniture seemed to be centuries old. When they were introducing Phil to the tropical fruit trees they grew, Abilene saw someone at the other end of the orchard. She immediately changed her city shoes into a pair of rubber boots and walked into the muddy farmland. Jason explained to Phil, "That's her great-uncle." When she had finished her greeting and walked back, Phil couldn't help but squint at her muddy boots. To his horror, he saw a long earthworm crawling beside her feet. He knew it was totally natural in this place, but he turned his head away and tried not to think about it. Abilene's parents were very quiet. During the New Year Eve dinner, they hardly spoke, even though all the delicious dishes had been prepared by them. After dinner, Phil expected to see them burn paper money and incense to worship local gods and ancestors, but they did not. "We are Christians," Abilene said. What a shock for Phil, to experience a humble farming family who were not believers of local deities but followers of Jesus. The atmosphere in the work became weird since Daphne got the phone call. She felt everyone was cautious in interacting with one another. Are they for the strike or against the strike? She kept raising the question to herself and dared not really ask anyone. The following weeks turned ugly. When the news of the pending strike was revealed, she heard all kinds of criticism. The strikers were called greedy, brainless women with no skill but appearing makeup. She knew a lot of people thought flight attendants were no more worthy than waitresses, and waitresses in Taiwan were deemed the least skillful people who took the minimum hourly wage. Was the public aware at all that their works were much more than just serving drinks and meals? She knew even waiting tables could be a tougher task than people thought. Still, she realized her pride was hurt being compared to a waitress. She felt so thankful when her colleagues clearly explained how their new working schedules had shortened the time they needed to rest and adjust to jet lag to the public in order to win more support. For example, flying from Taipei to Los Angeles took 12.5 hours, and their resting time was counted a half hour after the aircraft had landed, and after 10 hours they should be ready to fly again. Half hour after landing, most of the passengers would be still in the aircraft, and their company assumed they were off duty already. And even after they left the airport and checked in the hotel nearest to the airport, they would have fewer than 7 hours for sleep, and sleep should not be the only thing they could do between shifts. One had to be a robot to meet such workloads and schedules. The first week of his work, Abilene asked Phil to present a report on the yield curves of Taiwan's government bonds in terms of 2-year, 5-year, 10-year, and 20-year yields. They wanted to see the trends and the impact on Taiwan's financial industry. Never really having worked in financial business before, Phil barely knew how to make charts of yield curves. He spent several days and nights copying, pasting, and Google translating what he found online, and finally he turned in a 4-page paper with a chart on the last page. When Abilene took it, she skipped the first 3 pages that Phil had spent a lot of energy to put together, and turned directly to the chart. Immediately she said, "This can't be right." She lifted her head, asking, "Phil, what was your major in college?" "International relations," Phil added eagerly. "But I have an MBA from Dartmouth." "I know that." Abilene called Jason in and asked him to help Phil check his data again. Phil followed Jason to his desk and said annoyedly, "How does she know it's not right just by glancing at it?" "We have been watching it all the time, so we know what the curves must look like. Molly and I are compiling the paper about risks. Together, we will be able to analyze what shape Taiwan's bank industry is in. In this office, we use a lot of mathematics." Jason introduced Phil to several websites where they retrieve data. Most of them have an English version ready, but if you find something interesting, and you can't find it in English, you can always ask assistants for help. But it takes more time. In this business, everything is a race. Over the next 2 years, whenever Phil felt his paper was good enough to turn in, Abilene would ask him to add some parameters. As he did so, his models and formulae grew bigger and more complicated. At the same time, the total number of papers he submitted became much fewer than he had planned. At first, Daphne got endless calls from people at her airline. Some tried to dissuade her from participating in the strike, some expressed their concern for their jobs, and some advised her what to do, such as how to win more support from the public, and how to organize people and things once they needed to stay in the streets for more than 1 week. Of course, there were also phone calls, not without threats, and she did get worried whenever getting messages like that. But did she have a choice? The working conditions were so bad that she and her fellow flight attendants hardly had any personal life if they wanted to remain employed. But tons of comments under each of the online news articles about the strike said if they were not happy they should just quit and look for other jobs. She hated the sourness contained in such comments. The administration screwed it, and she and her colleagues were supposed to go? That's so unfair. And she also saw that usually people criticizing them were those who had no better working conditions. They talked about how their situations were twisted and how they swallowed it and survived. It surprised her. Shouldn't people suffering from being exploited stand together to fight instead of tolerating the worsening conditions they were given? Then the image of their union became to be discredited in the mass media. One of their high-ranked administrators even said to the reporters that the union was kidnapped by a few people who rejected rational negotiation. So her colleagues had to make a list of the past efforts they had tried for so long, but which had been completely ignored by the administration's reports to the news media. Then veterans of environmental protection, human rights watching, or anti-globalization activism told them that stigmatizing the protesting groups was a typical trick. There was no difference whether they were for their own welfare, working conditions, or for the environment, for human rights, or against globalization. They were also told to be prepared for the shit-digging of their private lives, especially the leaders of the strike. Daphne's mind was blown by their analysis of the street movements in the past. That was the politics she had always avoided to hear, to discuss. not to mention to get herself involved. Only if she could have stayed the way she was. From the TV news, a chairman of a large chain of convenience stores said, flight attendants on the strike would certainly lose their jobs and would not be hired by any other corporation. Now she was less scared by such remarks. She knew the chairman was kind of speaking to his own employees in case they demanded more from his own business. She had great fun when his talk only infuriated more people, and some activists pointed out that it was the evidence of the worsening problems of the employers of large corporations all over the world. Now, just after Thanksgiving, Abilene announced that she was retiring, and Phil seemed to be the only one surprised in the office. Abilene was only 44, and as a vice president of a European securities firm, she made good money and could be promoted and earn even more in the future. Why would she retire now? Abilene told them she was going back home to help her parents with their farming, and Phil found that hard to believe. If his friends back in the U.S. had achieved as much as Abilene, they'd buy bigger houses, drive fancier cars, or start collecting artworks. And Abilene was going back to the poor village to be a farmer? At the same time, Abilene sent Phil to a meeting in London right before Christmas to present their strategies in serving a Taiwanese appliance manufacturer to issue overseas corporate bonds in order to enter British and European markets. Why not Molly or Jason? Or anyone senior? Phil asked, and they said it was a relatively small business, and, you speak better English. It's your job to deal with English. No, in fact, I speak American. They laughed, although Phil felt nervous representing his business for the first time. After the meeting, you can fly back to the East Coast for Christmas, Abilene said. That was a bonus, because although there would be no trading during the Christmas holidays, Christmas was not a national holiday in Taiwan, and all his colleagues would still be in work. Abilene and Jason helped Phil prepare his presentation, and during their small talks, Phil vaguely suspected that he was sent to the meeting mainly because the Taiwanese team did not like the clients they were dealing now in London. It's an ancient strategy of war, matching your weakest team with the best of your opponents, and your best their second best. Your second best their weakest. Phil was pissed at first realizing it, but on the other hand, he did feel Abilene and Jason working so hard to assist him, and he learned a lot more than his usual working days. He also knew that part of his mission was to explain the differences of corporate governance in Taiwan and in the West due to the very different Asian culture, and why their clients should not expect things as they expected from other businesses they were familiar with. On December 18th, their strike organizers announced that the strike would start at midnight. Daphne and several of her colleagues who were not on duty the night before brought yoga pads, sleeping bags, water, and food to the headquarters of their airline for vigil. She was surprised that as the night dragged on, more and more people gathered there to express their support. They said it would be a historical incident that the oppressed workers could finally have a systematic protest which never ever could happen in the history of Taiwan before, thanks to the legacy of previous social movements in even more difficult times, as well as the solidarity of the union's nearly 3,000 members. But the dramas were staged at the airport. As the airline had to cancel more than 60 flights in the next day, travelers arriving at the airport realized that they couldn't fly and began to shout to the ground staff. Some blamed the flight attendants, calling them self-centered. Some pointed out that the administrators should be responsible for their inconvenience. The check-in counters of the airline became a circus ground, travelers with luggage scattered around, not knowing whether they should wait or should find tickets from other airlines or go home. From the TV news, she saw the ground staff bow to the angry travelers to apologize again and again. It was hard to see. She wished they had their own union, too. The CEO of their airline swore that everyone on strike would be fired and sued. The spokesman of the union expressed their regret that the administration had no intention to solve the problem, and the strike certainly would continue had the attitude of the high-ranking executives maintained like this. He also pointed out that the union has been dealing with such an attitude for years, and now the public finally was able to witness it. In the early morning, in the airport, Phil, with his luggage for the meetings in the UK and vacation back at home in the States, helplessly stood among the disappointed, angered, or desperate travelers. He had called Jason, and Jason called other airlines to find tickets for him, but of course any substitute ticket had been taken. Finally, they had to call London to inform their clients that the meeting was not going to happen. Phil was distressed. His Christmas break just burst with his opportunity to impress the clients in London. Abilene's moving day was scheduled a couple of days before Christmas, when all of the West began its holiday time. Out of curiosity, Phil volunteered to help her move. Since she still was coming back to Taipei from time to time, most of the stuff she packed were her books from her apartment. Before putting them into boxes, Abilene briefly introduced Phil to what kinds of books they were. Many of them were in Taiwanese, mostly very old and tattered, with the yellowed pages embrittled. Some of them smelled weird. One of them was a Bible, and many of the words were spelled with English letters to represent the sounds. Phil had no idea that written Taiwanese was different from Mandarin. "We lost a lot of this language," Abilene explained how previously Taiwanese had been banned from use in schools or on formal occasions. "That's why I use Taiwanese as much as I can, in case one day I forget how to speak my mother tongue." "I thought you spoke Taiwanese in order to exclude foreigners like me." "That's another reason, too." They both laughed out loud. On their ride to Chiayi, Abilene told Phil more about her family. Her parents had been victims of the White Terror for drafting a statement of human rights through a Presbyterian church in the 1970s. "What's the White Terror?" "A terrible repression of freedom of speech, where everything was under censorship." Born and raised in the U.S., it was hard for Phil to imagine what it could be like to live without freedom of speech, a right guaranteed by the First Amendment. The first, not the second or third. Freedom of speech was as natural as air to Americans. What obstacles were there for demanding human rights then? Too many things had to be operated secretly in the name of national security, and if they were examined, the faults, collusion, and corruption of the ruling power would be shaken. Expressing opinions freely, asking for democracy and transparent decision-making, criticizing the government without fear of persecution, those were rights that the regime couldn't afford to give to the people. What role did the church play? At first, the activists thought that the political powers wouldn't interfere with the church, and that the international connection between churches would pressure the government not to touch them. They were wrong. Their church was searched, and more than 2,000 copies of Taiwanese Bibles were confiscated. Why? Why confiscate Bibles in Taiwanese? They were used as evidence of separatism, for the independence of Taiwan. Abilene explained that a bunch of people were arrested, and her dad disappeared for 9 months. When he finally was released by the Secret Service, he became a completely different man. He retreated to the small village and became extremely quiet. "We never knew what happened during the 9 months of his incarceration, and ever since that time my entire family had been under surveillance. Law enforcement hassled us from time to time. In order to survive, he had to give up his activism, I suppose. He did not, though. We knew he always worked with his friends secretly. After the failure to launch a statement publicly, they knew their work must be accomplished underground." "Wow, that's courageous." "They have God." "But God failed them. Their tasks were aborted and they suffered. If there is more to accomplish in the future, God has allowed a failure." Phil turned to look at Abilene's profile, inquiring carefully, "Do you really believe that?" "No," Abilene replied without any hesitation. They laughed out loud together. With her eyes focusing on the road ahead, Abilene said, "Sometimes our inexplicable faith makes us believe we can endure greater hardship, so we are enabled to make noble decisions. If it was me, I would have given up and stayed down, speaking and writing only harmless things. I believe my parents considered that, too, but the situation did not allow for it. Censorship is not like setting a boundary between what you can express and what you cannot. It operates together with fear, distrust, and hatred, like a web repressively entangling and tightening your mind all the time. Your life gradually erodes until—" "It's impossible to swallow." Phil found the words that Abilene failed to grasp. "Exactly." 3 o'clock in the morning. The number of people gathering in front of the airline's headquarters increased steadily. Tents were set up. Bottled water and food were delivered. Together with the banners they had manufactured, she realized that to the activists of many social issues, what they were doing was nothing different to a street movement. The flight attendants on strike represented all the laborers needing to improve their working conditions. Their strikes were the headlines of every news media in Taiwan. She never thought of it. She never thought of herself being equal to the workers from the factories shut down because of the WTO, or the highway toll collectors losing their jobs after the system of electronic toll collection was adopted, or the students occupying the parliament to terminate the free trade agreement with China. Dozing during the vigil, Daphne dreamed of herself flying to London again. She liked the city very much. She wished she would have more time to see it. The strike must succeed. The strike must succeed, she murmured. She did not want to just sleep her time in London away, but the time for rest was so short that she was going to miss it again. Stay with us, stand with us. Her colleagues were singing to fend off the sleepiness. Cups of coffee were passed around. Was that how those laid-off factory workers were doing during their days, even weeks of street protests? It was the first time in life Daphne felt she was taking risks beyond her control. On the other hand, she felt she was protected, by her colleagues as well as those strangers surrounding them. She must have slipped into sleep on the cardboard ground when rain dropped on her face. Protesters began to move toward the canopies of buildings or tents set up earlier for them. Light ponchos were passed around. When the rain became really heavy, the union leaders announced that they should go home and come back at 9 p.m. since the negotiation had kicked off. Damp and tired, Daphne agreed it was a good idea. After 3.5 hours driving, they arrived in Abeline's hometown. As Phil was helping her unpack the boxes of books, arranging them on shelves which were roughly made of bricks and wooden panels, he felt Abeline's father's gaze. He could hardly conceal his agitation. Touching each book carefully, Abeline told Phil, "I rescued these books when I was barely a teenager. At one point the situation was so tense, we saw men in black suits around our home day and night. Although my parents never said so, I knew they had lost several contacts. My mom freaked out. She urged my dad to destroy everything that could criminalize him, including these books. I knew how important they were to my dad. So one night I put them with bags of livestock feed in a pushcart and pushed them to a nearby pigsty. I covered them with rags and pig manure. It was so stinky that I believed no policeman would bother to search there." When all the books had been put away, Abeline approached Phil and said in a lowered voice, "We don't talk about my family's past at home, so please do not mention what we just talked about." "I understand." But Phil didn't really understand. After all, it had been a long time, and Taiwan had become a different society now. Phil, Abeline, and her parents dined together that night. Although there were fewer dishes, Phil felt the food tasted even better than the New Year Eve feast from 2 years ago. After dinner, Abeline's parents vacated a room where Phil could crash. Before going to bed, he couldn't help but ask Abeline, "Don't they oppose your decision to give up the high-paying job and move back here?" Abeline smiled. "They don't know how much I make, and even if they did, they won't care." Abeline told Phil she was going to study sociology in college, but her parents warned her not to touch politics. "Sociology is not politics." "It could be very political, so I picked a business school instead. Anyway, Marx's Capital had been banned until the 90s. What would be the point of studying sociology without Marxism in the Frankfurt School? It would be like Kung Pao chicken without chicken." "Impossible to swallow." They laughed. At home, Daphne began to read news right after taking a shower. Updates of the strike on digital media poured in, and from non-mainstream media. She read analysis on the first large strike for decades in Taiwan, together with issues of neoliberalism, market rules, and free trade. The new proletariats in the post-industrial era included people from the service industries, and the battlefields of class conflict were in the streets of the cities, compared to the past when it happened in or around the factories. Exactly. She was convinced that she and her fellow flight attendants were 100% proletariats without any productive tools. She read on. The digital devices might have changed the means of communication and the patterns of economies, but it never changed the nature of exploitation. Yes, well said. Free trade agreements between nations have become the most powerful method to serve multinational corporations, at the price of the benefits of farmers, laborers, and consumers. Thus, resistance must process from different paths with differentiated strategies, from the side of production as well as from the side of consumption. So their strike was actually connected to the occupation of Parliament by students 2 years ago? The free trade agreement between Taiwan and China was believed to be very harmful to farmers and small businesses, and only large corporations benefited, for they could import cheaper materials, cheaper laborers, and cheaper service. She never really figured out what might happen once the free trade agreement was signed, but out of her distrust of the government and the more and more brazen measures taken by large companies against allowing their employees to have more holidays and higher compensation for extra works, she had no doubt that the students must be right about the negative influence of the free trade. Daphne knew she needed some sleep, but she couldn't. She also knew it was impossible to sort out any answer for such a complex situation, but she felt restless to absorb information about it. A lot more key words needed to be explored. At last, she decided she was too tired to do any further research and should take off for their second round of gathering in front of the airline headquarters. Back to the street, the temperature had dropped significantly. Some of the old faces from last night returned. Some new faces joined them. The next morning, Phil was treated to a breakfast of rice porridge with yams in it, freshly fried fish, and several dishes of preserved vegetables. Then Abilene drove him to the high-speed railway station. One thing I have to ask you. When I made the mistake of confusing up limit and lower limit, you could have just turned me in and got rid of me. I know I am not particularly productive in your team. Why did you cover up for me? When a team is working on a task, it is like a runner's relay race. The one given the baton runs as fast as he can, and as far as he is allowed until he can no longer make it. He gives the baton to anyone who is able to continue, and does not blame anyone who runs slower or not far enough. Everyone has different obstacles to overcome and dilemmas to face. We are not in any position to condemn anyone. That's the mentality I learned from my father, on account of what he fought for, along with all the nameless, faceless heroes and martyrs. When Phil was deeply touched by what Abilene said, she added in a cold voice, "But do not have an illusion of comradeship. I defended you because you are, generally speaking, creating more value for our output than troubles. It's still the cruel rules of capitalism." After 5 days in the streets, one night they were told that the CEO of their airline was replaced by the board. All of them applauded cheerfully. The union told the news media again that what they asked for, to reschedule the inhuman working hours, would never change, no matter who was the CEO. Around midnight, the union representatives returned with good news. Their harsh new working schedule was withdrawn. A schedule no worse than the one they had would be decided in 3 days, and before that time any member of the union could decide whether they wanted to work or not. It was quick. They actually had prepared to be in the street for at least 1 week. Daphne knew as flight attendants they were lucky because their strike could attract great attention from the public, compared to other workers from textile factories or highway toll booths. She went to fill in the flight schedule in the following 3 days. She knew that the earlier they started working, the earlier the pissed-off passengers would spare the ground staff. She wanted to fly to London, the admirable city she never had time to explore. In the meeting at 7:45 a.m., 1¼ hours before the trading of stock market began, Molly told everybody she has downgraded her view of the airline. "You downgraded it when the strike began, and now the strike is over, you downgraded it again?" Phil asked. "Yes, I've calculated, according to the new deal between its administration with the flight attendants, it will eat up its profit up to around 13 million USD a year." Phil sat back, thinking how absurd this world has become. When a corporation has more humane working conditions, It must be downgraded for its potential investors. Merry Christmas. As the meeting was dismissed, Phil said to his hard-working colleagues, who seemed unaware and unimpressed that it was Christmas.